Peter today, Dr. Peter Tierney. Welcome to the Petey Performance Podcast. How's your morning going so far? Have you just started? And are you working from home today, or are you going into the office, or what way does that work?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, am I the first Peter you've had on? But maybe not. Is that?
No, you're not actually.
Right.
You could have a podcast, I'd say, where you only interview Peters, and it might be a very niche market you go for there. But Peters have very interesting things to say typically.
But yeah, it's like 8 o'clock in the morning. So just got up and went for a stroll, grabbed a coffee, and then plan today, I think, is just to work from home. But office is only like a 7-minute cycle, so like I've gone in sometimes like for the morning and come home at lunch, or kind of vice versa. So the flexibility is good.
And what sort of things are you getting up to on a daily basis? If you can fill us in, I know you can't fill us in too much into where you're going in the future, but I'm sure it's quite refreshing from the humdrum of elite sport for so many years to go into, say, an industry where you're going to be working primarily with the general population, or thinking with the general population in mind, at least.
Yeah, it's very different, the role and like the style of working, but there are definitely like similarities to it as well. So like I've spent like the last kind of 6 months like kind of thinking about like, I don't know how different it is, but then some of the similarities in terms of like how I'd approach some stuff. So I'm working in like product innovation. So like I can't really go into like the specifics of what that is and stuff, but like I guess that there are times when, particularly similar to like the role I had in England in the FA, where there are periods where the cadence of work is like really, really fast. So I kind of see that as similar to when I would have been on camp in like an international team, and it's basically just go for up to 10 days, and then you sort of take a breath afterwards. And there's periods like that in this role, and it is quite fast paced in general. But then there's also times when you have a little bit more time to think about the problem or the concept or the project that we're working on and stuff as well. So there's definitely, it like ebbs and flows, and like just things pop up, and things change, and you have to be pretty agile. But I see a lot of those things like they happen in sport and performance roles as well, where you have to be agile and react and try be proactive in like how you deal with different situations and scenarios. So yeah, similar but very different as well.
Do you find that has stood to you in going into this role, and your ability to react and think on the fly and move very quickly? Because I would imagine that there are lots of people you work with from the business industry or from a business perspective that have had to deal with something very similar, but still I would imagine that your approaches are quite different. And I know you've spoken before about working in the diverse team of the FA. Is it a similarly diverse kind of working environment in Lululemon?
Yeah, it definitely is. And like even like going from Leinster to the FA was like such an increase in just the size of the organization. Like obviously the FA is a national governing body, and like just a much larger organization than Leinster. And I guess like having to work with like different stakeholders and consider how like different, I guess, like partners within the business think about things or approach things, or even when you're looking for budget for things, is like all those other elements that maybe I had like a little bit less exposure to in Leinster, not by like as a negative or by fault of anybody, but just by nature of the size of the organization. And if I wanted something, I pretty much had to ask 2 people, and then it was sort of approved in that sense. But with the FA and Lululemon, there's a few more different, like, not hoops to jump through, but just like there's more to it and there's just more partners and more stakeholders involved in sort of every decision. But certainly like getting used to being agile and reacting very quickly to things, like those elements from sport, like I don't think that like phases me as much as maybe it might if somebody who hasn't worked in sports. So like if something changes today in work, it's sort of okay, because I've experienced that a lot in sport, and things change like every day. Like every session something happens, or somebody gets pulled out of a session, or I know the head coach tells you something's changed, and you sort of just react to that. So like, yeah, definitely get used to that, like dealing with that element of change. Yeah.
So that has led to it's being a strength for you by the sounds of things. But then on the flip side of that, is there anything that you absolutely do not miss about working in sport?
I don't know. Like I've spoken to a few people about this. Like I don't think I'm not one of those people who's like you know, vacated a couple of roles in sport or gone into an industry-based role, and I'm very bitter about, oh, like I hated this and I didn't like these people. Like I don't have that, like I don't have that experience with me. So like I enjoyed, like, you know, my roles in sport, and like I really liked working with different people. So I don't think I have like certain things that hang over me to say like, oh, I regret this, or like, you know, I hated doing this. So I don't think I have that really as such. Like look, there's always things in every role or every job or place you're working where you're like, oh, you know, like this could be slightly better, or I could have improved this, or I could have done this better as well. But I don't have like, you know, one or two things that jump out to me to say like, oh, I really, really miss this.
So it sounds like from a structural and organizational perspective, you don't miss anything. So what you do miss, then, would it be fair to say maybe the people that you've met along the way and the people that you've got to work with?
Definitely, yeah. And like to say like there's certain elements definitely of like coaching and delivery, like that face-to-face stuff. Like we're still face-to-face with different people in the organization, and we do some testing with external people. So like you still get that, but you definitely get very used to being with like groups of athletes and people. So that's definitely like the biggest change. But I don't know, I guess if you look at it like slightly differently, like you're always working with people no matter what role you're in, whether it's in sport or coaching or something else. It's just like how you interact with people. So like that'd be an element that I'm definitely like adjusting to. Is like not, you know, being face to face with like groups of athletes and having to deliver or to coach sort of recovery sessions or gym sessions, that type of thing. So yeah, that'd be like an element that, yeah, like again, I don't know if I want to use the phrase like I'm missing it, but I'm definitely like adjusting to not having that element in my role.
So in terms of the adjustment, it's a big adjustment given that you've moved continent completely. And you just touched on there that you don't get to see as many people on a daily basis as you would have when you were coaching. And you probably don't get to hang out with as many people as you would have when you were coaching. So then, since you moved country and just uplifted your life and moved over there, have you been actively kind of seeking out opportunities to meet people within kind of your personal life? Do you think a little bit more because you've been missing that in a professional sense?
Well, like, I guess, I don't know, even, I think when I've been in the office, and like I'm in the office sort of maybe 3 days a week, it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 2. It kind of just depends on like the week and what we're doing. But I don't know, like it depends on how you look at it, because across the whole day, I probably interact with maybe as many people as I did in a football or rugby role. But like I guess in rugby or in like a performance coach role, you have like, again, like pockets where like you might have 2 gym sessions and you're like surrounded by people. But then in a sports scientist role as well, there's always hours where you're probably on your own in front of your laptop doing stuff. Whereas like when I'm in the office now, there's always constantly like different people around, and you've got different meetings. Like I'm connecting with people on Zoom and work from, you know, like different places in the world as well. So like, I don't know if you, I haven't done this in my head, but if you average it out, it probably works out about the same in terms of like number of people. That's professionally. And then I guess personally, like I moved here with my girlfriend, and we know like some people here, not like loads. And I say that in a kind of a nice way. Like we haven't moved here just to like maintain like the exact same people that we have, but we've also had some family visiting. We've been on the go. It's been pretty hectic, like the first few months, because we were in a temporary accommodation for a while. It took us a while to find like our own accommodation, and a lot of evenings were sort of made up with like just trying to furnish the place and just a lot of stuff. And like we might speak about it again towards the end, but like I probably underestimated the stress involved. I'm not say like I was like wound up, but like just underestimated how much like time and energy that like that stuff takes up, and how much like, you know, you only have a certain capacity for stress or like function in your brain. So I definitely underestimated, and like the impact that had, because like when you're in work and you have to like organize something for like 4 o'clock or like that evening, like it kind of looms over you. So like I definitely, when we're sort of settled into our own place now, and I sort of I don't know, have a sense of like relief, or like just I have like more space, mental space to actually think about stuff in work and like personally as well now. So like, yeah, I definitely underestimated the stress involved, like relocating, but also like furnishing a place, because we didn't bring much stuff with us. So we're pretty much starting from like zero furniture. So that was a bit more than I anticipated.
But like you said there, when we say stress, people think it's that physical kind of stress, like you feel stressed. But when you say stress, you mean like a stressor, like in a scientific sense. And you have far more stressors. And I was actually during the week trying to explain this to a coach and an athlete, in that we had video sessions and I was like, that's a stress. And one of them was like, well, I'm not stressed when I'm watching that video, like when we're talking about that. And I was like, well, you're not stressed, but it's a stress. It's a stressor. Like you're having to digest information, you're having to stay focused throughout that. And then likewise, like even things that happen in our life that we have to go and do that might not stress us out, they are a stressor, like they cause stress. And that has to manifest in some way, I suppose. But it sounds like now you're starting to get some time to yourself, and it's only when the stressors are removed that you realize that they were a stress in the first place.
Yeah, I think, yeah, everybody, like athletes and people in general, I think just associate stress with like physical stress. So it's like, I've done a really tough workout, or I ran this, or I've done some weights and I'm sore. But yeah, there's just so much more to it. And like everything accumulates into like stress. So like even when I speak about recovery and sleep and that type of stuff in general, like it's recovering from other things that aren't just like physical. There's a lot of like mental and social aspects to that as well. So definitely trying to strike the right balance between all the stress that I impose on myself, and also trying to recover from that as well.
So then, like, I have read a number of your articles that you've written around recovery, sleep, and stress, etc. And in your new role, like you're dealing with the general population and you're thinking with them in mind an awful lot. Do you think that is something that's commonly missed by the general population, that kind of thought pattern around stress, and then that attitude towards their sleep and their recovery?
Yeah, I think people in general, I wouldn't even make the differentiation between like general population and athletes. I think people in general do underestimate how, and I did it myself, I've done it myself, like how stressful like non-physical stress can be. So I think, yeah, like people underestimate that, and they think, okay, like people resort to like thinking about recovery as like recovering from a session. And then like that inherently brings with it like, okay, people don't think about recovery in like the general like nutrition or sleep or just rest sense. They think about recovering from a session. So they think, okay, straight after the session, like what do I do to recover? And you got to think about it in like a wider sense, like the whole day or the whole week. So that was one of the things that we did in the FA. We tried to like, and I don't take all credit for this at all. It was like a department thing, but the concept or the project that we initiated was termed the other 22 hours. So we tried to coin like recovery as the other 22 hours in the day that were away from training and matches. So the 2 hours you do are, training, football, whatever it was, but everything else you do in the whole day, so sleep, nutrition, recovery, rest, they were the things that made up recovery, as opposed to it just being recovery after a session. So try to get that, like flip the mindset away from just like focusing on one session to being like the whole day.
Difficult thing though to shift mindsets, like, and people want that quick fix. And I saw what you shared on Twitter during the week, ice baths. They want some sort of modality that they can do and finish and complete in less than a half an hour. And then they reckon, right, I have nothing else to do. I can do whatever I want for the rest of the day. I can go on Call of Duty for 4 hours and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And like there's some elements that you have to like speak to people where like they want, like what they want or what they believe in as well. So that's certainly an element or elements of recovery as well. So whilst like the majority of it, I believe, is your sort of big rocks and like sleep, hydration, nutrition, like there are definitely elements where you do need to, I guess, like appease the individual's like beliefs around certain things. So that's definitely a component of it as well.
And you were working with a lot of younger athletes as well when you were in the FA from a personal standpoint, I know. So was that even harder to kind of get them around to that kind of mindset of the 22 hours post training because they might have been, and I use this word lightly now, don't hold it against me, listeners, but slightly more immature, literally?
Yeah. Like, because it was good in the role in the FA that like you get to work across like such a wide range of athletes, like male and female. And one of the challenges, but the sort of like enjoyable components of the projects that we had to lead were that they had to account for not only the team that you were delivering to, but you had to account. So like this recovery project, it had to be suitable to be applied with under 15s and seniors, men and women. So that was definitely like I said, one of the challenges, one of the enjoyable things about the projects, because you had to think about it, like take a step back and think about, okay, how can like this impact every team that we work with? So like, honestly though, sometimes with the younger athletes, they're almost better. One, because like they're so interested, because there's a lot of new information to them, and they'll almost do anything. And some of my experience with some of the female teams, they would actually do anything to just get better. So they were like, in some instances, they were just like brilliant, and they were almost better than some of the senior athletes because they were so keen. And that's not to say senior athletes were bad, but in like that, the point I'm trying to make is like, yeah, some of the younger ones were actually better. And also like we tried to use some like nudges for, if we were delivering to some of the younger teams, we tried to get some of the senior athletes to speak about their experiences with sleep recovery and training, how they manage themselves. So instead of it being me or the nutritionist or like another performance coach standing at the top of a gym explaining, like recovery and this is important, we interviewed and recorded some of the senior athletes and we said, well, like, here, you speak about this and listen to the people you look up to as opposed to me. Listen, see what they have to say. And then that was, that's one of the strategies around like trying to, I guess, not like convince people, but trying to provide some behavioral like nudges and things towards people making better decisions around recovery.
And then like you've touched on it there, that you had to alter kind of how you were presenting everything to cater for the different groups. In the presentations that you presented or you delivered, was that like a conscious thing in your mind, right? These are under 15, so I'm going to use a language that suits them more so than if I'm talking to the senior players, as you said, I'm not going to use quite the same analogies or quite the same language, or even the same probably visual presentation. It might slightly differ per group.
Definitely, yeah. And that was such a different challenge in the FA than Leinster. One, because like a lot of the guys that worked in Leinster, they've been training in like that environment, like gym, fitness, like throughout schools and sub academy. So like we're very lucky, and like you could sort of realize when you leave that they're like you could pretty much just put a session on the board and guys would do it with really good technical proficiency, really high intent. Like they would do it. And like even if you didn't put a session on the board, if you left guys in Leinster for an hour in the gym, they probably have a really good idea of what to do. Like give or take, obviously they need they need a coach at some stage. But if there was one session where no coach was there, they'd probably just crack on and do something. But one of the biggest differences is like in the FA, and it's not just the FA, but like international football or international sport is quite different to domestic or provincial because, well, one of like the biggest difference being the competition turnaround and how like congested fixtures are. And also we only see the athletes for a fraction of the time that a club would see them. So initially, or like immediately, you have to consider, okay, like how can I inspire or like educate these athletes that isn't just, okay, come on in, let's do this gym session, because it won't really work in that setting. And we spent a lot of time like discussing like what we would call like a lesson plan, and even when you asked a question or like a presentation, like I think people probably default to thinking, okay, you have to stand at the top of the room and present like a PowerPoint. But a lot of our like lessons weren't actually, or not always, like presenting. A lot of it was like doing or like experiencing. So like you can teach someone about recovery like whilst they're doing it. So like, even like a contrast water bath, you can get them to do that, and whilst they're doing it, you start to like explain, you play some games with them, and they understand it through that way. It's not me at the top of the room speaking about it. Same with the nutritionists. They had some really clever sort of like analogies and sort of almost like props and gimmicks to try teach people about like how a muscle absorbs glycogen and like all of these different things. So when, yeah, like lesson plans or like presentation or like, I guess education doesn't have to be, you know, the coach at the top of the room. It can be a load of different ways. So we had to think about that quite a lot. Yeah.
So as well as that, like you touched on it there as well, but like the demographic in Leinster is going to be quite similar because they've all played age grade together the whole way up. And like it or not, me saying that it's changing now, but like the majority of the group will have come from a smaller locality than in other groups, in other teams, especially in England in the FA. They're coming from all over the country, like, and the country is far bigger than Ireland. So the language you use and the way that you present or the way that you teach has to cater for very different demographics and very different people that learn in different ways. So, but it sounds like at the same time in Leinster, there was a bit of that going on, that interactive type of teaching. Do you think that you learned a lot of useful tools in Leinster that kind of benefit you in terms of your delivery of lesson plans then going into the FA?
I would say it, yeah, like it definitely prepared me in terms of like delivering to like bigger groups or having some characters that you had to like manage, because, you know, like even though we say like within Leinster people sort of from the same province or like a lot of people from Dublin and around the province, but there were also some people who were just very different, and there were some people who, you know, like just characters brought in and like having to manage characters within a larger group, definitely like you learn pretty quickly like what you have to do or what you shouldn't do as well. So probably more so in that sense, but I definitely had to think very differently in the FA in terms of, yeah, like cues and different like language, and even the language thing around like going from rugby to like soccer. I have to call it soccer now because I'm on the North American continent. But like they didn't want I didn't think they wanted someone who would be like just speaking in rugby terms. And like, whilst I had the experience in rugby, that didn't really matter to like any of the coaches or the players there. So even just like really simple language things around like how coaches and players speak about like football or soccer as opposed to rugby. So like instead of like, I don't know, like it's not off, it's like offense and defense, it's in possession, out of possession, or it's not attack and defense, you know, like there's just really subtle like nuanced phrases that I was like, okay, at least if I can pick these up pretty quickly, I can start to try to relate anything in the gym or anything kind of physical performance related to football actions on the pitch.
What aspects of rugby did integrate well into that environment from you? And then on the other side, what aspects of a football program or even the way that coaches speak it to football or soccer athletes can you see making a big impact in a rugby sense if they were incorporated into a rugby environment?
I think one thing definitely from rugby to football is just the level of, well, like one, intent, but two, like consistency of like physical training. Like if you tried to take a gym session away from rugby guys, they'd almost like, they'd argue it and they'd be like, no, like, come on, I'll do it like this. I want to get this done. Because they've, again, like they've been brought up, that's part of like the culture or like the week of rugby, you know, it's such a big component of it. And the intent that, again, in my experience, the guys in Leinster have, like, they'll move things quickly and they'll push themselves to the point where you have to sort of almost pull them back a little bit sometimes. So yeah, that intent and like consistency, and I say consistency as in these guys will do that for the whole season. It's not just like, okay, work hard in preseason and then just like play games. It's like they will do that. They will have that level of intent and consistency throughout the whole season. So I think that's something that, like I say this, I'm generalizing here, but like if I think that's something that if that like soccer, I guess, like teams, and this isn't to say that every team doesn't have this, but like if players have that level of intent and consistency across the whole season, it's different though as well, because think about Premier League and Champions League, you're playing 2 games a week minimum. So like it's obviously very different, but that'd be probably one thing. But then on the flip of that, from football to rugby, like, I think one of the biggest things, not that I realized, but again, it was just by nature of like having to think about things differently, was that there's just so many different strategies to achieving improved physical performance. And it doesn't always have to be in the gym, or it doesn't always have to be the same exercise that people have spoken about or done. So like we had to think about things very differently, because even, for example, like you go to places in Europe or you travel a lot and you mightn't have gym access that's close, and you have to think about, okay, how can we provide a physical stimulus that, you know, on the pitch or like beside the pitch or in the hotel or in the car park, and just, you have to be very creative with certain things. So that's probably one thing that I think, not that like rugby could take from football, but there's just so many different ways that you can achieve, improve physical performance, that like I think sometimes it's easy in rugby to just fall into like, okay, we'll just do these like 6 exercises and kind of carry on. But there's just so much out there that might end up, you know, improving performance to an even greater degree than something that someone's done for the last 6 years.
Do you think in rugby we sometimes are in a little bit of a bubble and we all just do what the other team is doing or the other coach is doing, and sometimes we are a little bit reluctant to try newer things? And then, as well as that, you've talked about it there, like the players love the gym. Do you think we throw in an awful lot of unnecessary volume in the gym looking for adaptation just because they enjoy it, where we could get probably the same, or not, or maybe not the same, but almost the same amount of adaptation with a little bit less? That's a general question as well. I know you hate the general ones.
No, in terms of adaptation, I don't think so, because like I do think rugby players need they need a lot of muscle mass. So I do think the volume is necessary in some instances. So no, I don't, and that's just my experience of it. I don't think that's the case. And then, so your first question around like rugby sort of, I guess, being like sort of closed, like that's not my experience from like Leinster or the IRFU. I actually thought we were quite good at like, you know, the professional development opportunities, or like we had sort of external speakers and like lectures and stuff that happened across Leinster and the IRFU. So I thought in Ireland anyway, that was quite good. We got access to experts and people across different fields, and even like, I guess personally, I ended up speaking to like, you know, different practitioners. Even in rugby, when I was working in Leinster, I ended up speaking to people in football about like some of the processes that they were using with like GPS or recovery and that type of stuff. So I think it's probably easy to fall into the trap of like, oh, like Munster or Leinster are doing this, like let's just do that. But like that doesn't necessarily work. But yeah, my experience, I think once you're curious enough to have some conversations with people outside, you realize that there's just a lot more out there.
Are there many instances that you can remember where you tried something and then said, actually, this doesn't work, throw it out?
Yeah, probably. Like, I don't know if I can pick one or two specific examples, but certainly cases where, you know, I thought like I remember writing like a warm up and I was just trying to be like organized. And then when I delivered it, I think it was even like during a game or something, or like before a game, I remember thinking like, I was just like completely like over coaching something. And one of the guys was like, he was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, oh God, I just like scrapped the whole thing and just like forgot about it. But that was definitely like a point where I realized, okay, like, even though you're trying to be like organized and like get stuff, like the athletes don't want to hear all of that sometimes. They just want like one thing to like think about. So that was probably like, that was early on. That was a good few years ago now, but like that was a good like learning point where I was like, shit, like I can't overcomplicate this. And then I don't know if there's other one, but yeah, there's loads of different instances across like Leinster and the FA where like I was like, okay, that didn't work. And then, but it's like you get better at adjusting that on the go. So it's not like I had to do the whole session and then go, oh, like why did I do that? I think you start to realize like the more sessions you deliver, you start to realize, okay, this isn't working, as opposed to this hasn't worked. So then you just adjust on the fly, and then like for the next session, you know better. So
I know exactly what you're talking about as well. Sometimes you catch yourself mid like I don't know, ramble, and you're like, what am I talking about? They don't care. They ask me a very specific, easy question, like, and then just stop yourself, cut yourself off.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, like, is there anything that didn't work in the past that you think may work given the right context or the right environment?
From like a training sense, or
Yeah,
just
training sense, I would say.
Oh, I don't know actually. I'd have to think about that one a bit more. I don't know if there's anything like specifically that like didn't work in the past. Like way back, I do remember we had an altitude. This is like when I first started. We had an altitude chamber, one pre-season in Leinster, and we used it like quite a lot because there was a bit of emerging research about like repeated sprint training within a chamber. And this is quite like a specific example, but we did some testing with some of the academy guys, and then did like an intervention in or out. So we had like a really good like study, but we ended up not being able to do like the final kind of post intervention test. So I would have loved to know like what the effect was in our population with that. Like I know there's been some other research published, but I would have loved to know specifically that the result of that. So if I could go back, I'd probably do that one again, but that's a bit of a niche and pretty expensive one to do as well because the chamber isn't cheap. So I just remember thinking like, oh, like I think there was a game on or something where some of the guys couldn't test that week. I was thinking, oh, like not as such a waste of the summer, but I was just like, oh, we actually like, I would have loved to know what the effect was that we had with those guys. But that's probably one like specific one that I can think of.
That must have killed you as well after putting that in all the effort, like on this research side of it, and then you're like, I'm not going to get the results of this. Theo, can you spare a few of them, and I'm going to test them. They can't turn out at the weekend.
Yeah.
But I've heard you talking about the sleds and the momentum study that you did, and I actually read through it there earlier today. And I know that in the past you've said that you kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole yourself around it, and you probably didn't get to implement it to the same extent as you would have liked. What about that study would you have liked to implement that you probably didn't get the opportunity to because it's such a time restricted and dynamic kind of working environment? As you just said, like you'll have games that crop up, so everything isn't going to work practically.
I would have loved to use it with more athletes, to be honest. I think like there's this sort of like, I don't know, like preconceived notion that like doing sleds is like a dangerous exercise because it's like dynamic and stuff. But I don't think it is. I think it's probably the opposite. It actually probably puts people into good positions and maybe slows them down a little bit. So if anything, I don't know, it's like it's a high force, obviously, but I don't see it the same. So I think we were maybe like a little bit cautious with some athletes who didn't. It was like, oh, we're not going to do sleds with these athletes because it's like they're maybe whatever their injury history or it's a high. So I would have just loved to do it with more people, to be honest. But I think in terms of like what we're doing, like, yeah, we did it over a kind of a set distance. And if I had more time and more people, I think we would have been able to establish like, you know, people working across different distances with sleds. But I thought like I don't think like we thought about it a lot and we spent a lot of time in the background. Like I did a lot of stuff in the background with Keane Gormley, just like piloting some stuff and just figuring out what the best way to do it was. So I think by the time we got to delivering it with players, like we actually tried, we collected some data initially, I think using like velocity decrement. I found that more challenging to implement practically than this, because once we had it set up, we had a couple of sleds. We only had one set of timing gates, but we had a couple of different sleds. But like, if you have two staff, you could probably do it with one as well. But like, it actually flows pretty well, and it actually works really like efficiently. So I don't think I would change anything about that. But yeah, I just would love to do it on more people. But I thought like, you know, with some athletes, we had some pretty good effect. Even just like technically with sleds, and it puts people in good positions as well. And then also like we did see a lot of people like progress in terms of momentum over like for those that actually committed to it consistently over like a number of weeks and months. We did see some improvements across that. So yeah, I just would have liked more people.
I have the same issue with athletes and the sleds as well. And I think it's because they associate the intent with an increased risk of injury. And that might be positive or negative, but because it's hard, they're like, this is effing hard, so I must be at risk of injury. Whereas realistically, if they have a history of lower extremity injury, as you just said, the sled's going to slow them down. So it's probably safer for them to do that than to actually sprint at close to their max velocity, even though you've got to get them to do both.
Yeah, we did do both. Like we had like max velocity exposure on the pitch and stuff, but this was a sort of a way of targeting probably the acceleration component, but then they actually related quite well. So we did relate like how their sled momentum to like their peak velocity momentum, and they're like, I think the relationship we found was like 0.92, so it was nearly perfect. So that's not to say that like that's causing one or the other, but like it's interesting that it seemed in the population that we collected the data in, that those that were very fast or had a high momentum, like unresisted top speed, were also able to produce high momentum in the sled, but it could also be vice like the other way around as well. So I'd love to explore that a little bit more. And like you said, you asked the question around what would I do differently? Like I think it would be interesting to do a training intervention with that, like as in have two different groups. But again, that's just, I mean, you probably do that over preseason. It's difficult to do in season when we did most of that sled work.
And the majority of them are going to want to be in the group that you're trialing as well, because they're going to want to get the benefits. Nobody wants to be in control. How do you control? Like, just don't put any weight on the sled and tell them to do that. I was actually going to ask you as well about the velocity decrement kind of approach to it as well, because Les Spellman does something similar. Well, he uses that when he's loading up his sleds, and that's what he uses for his athletes. But then I was thinking, why does he do that? Whereas in rugby, you guys did it with the momentum kind of based assessment. And I was like, he is preparing athletes for the combine. So he's preparing them to run a 40. Whereas in your sleds, you are preparing them essentially to generate a higher amount of momentum, because you want them to be dominant in the carry and you want them to be able to repeat that. So was that a factor in that at all, or was it simply because, as you just said, the velocity decrement was just a little bit harder to calculate or to control, I suppose?
Yeah, it was like elements of all of that. Like one, the momentum is so directly like important in a contact sport, a collision sport. But I guess like he's still training like NFL athlete, so it's still important there as well. But it was one that like connected to rugby and like on pitch very well. So in terms of a training methodology that like I could go to like the coaches or the athletes and say, okay, this is why we're doing this. This is what it relates to. It was a very easy sort of sell, and they bought into it like very, very quickly. The velocity decrement, like it's well researched, and I don't want to say that I'm against that like training methodology. I just found it like more difficult logistically. Maybe it was just because at the time it was myself managing it. And like one other coach. So like, I just found it more, like a little bit trickier to manage like in an applied sense. And then also with velocity decrement at the time anyway, it like sort of restricted us to like that set distance. So I think we did it over 20 meters. We wanted something a little bit shorter. And also I believe that momentum, if you use momentum for resisted sled loading, you can also, you not only identify the optimal, I don't want to use that word, the correct or like the preferred loading to generate the highest momentum, but you potentially can also identify the optimal distance for that as well, because momentum takes into account like distance, speed, and load. I believe that it if we had more time and space, you could have had athletes running, okay, like for you, we want 10 meters, 15 meters, 5 meters, 20 meters. Like you could actually vary the distance with just the same calculation.
I'm right there with you, but I'm just thinking, if you're a slow accelerator, good luck, because you're going to be running a long distance with that sled on you. So that would not be as fun, but you're not going to have that many of them in a rugby setting anyway, because like all your forwards are going to be used to accelerating over 10 meters. And then all your backs, generally, if they're going to be any good, they're going to have a high rate of acceleration. And like momentum is so useful and so easy to calculate that like I would imagine that most schools in Dublin now are doing it, or in the Leinster Senior Cup, because I know a certain school that was doing it, and it's probably 5 or 6 years ago. And it's it's just useful to know who your carriers are. Now, they still have to catch the ball and carry, but when you're in Leinster, you're going to assume that everybody's going to catch the ball and carry hard playing off of that.
I remember actually at the time when I was like exploring it, I remember we collected, this was not sled related, this was just like momentum from max speed or max velocity, sorry. And we I like ranked everybody in each position across like the peak momentum. And I remember I just like did it. I was like, this would be interesting to see, like, so I just I made a team sheet like myself. It was one afternoon and it was like 1 to 15 and 20 or 1 to 23. And I remember like the team and I was like, oh, okay, that's like actually not too far off what like the starting team for Europe was the week before or something. So I remember going into, I think I went into Leo at the time and I was explaining this. I was like, have a look at this. This is like what, this is the team that came out when I picked it based off of like one variable. And he was like, yeah, it was pretty similar. So I was like, that was early on in this kind of whole like exploration of momentum. So I was like, oh, maybe there's something there. Now, obviously, I'm not saying we ever selected a team based off of, but it was interesting to see that whether by, I don't know, unconsciously, for whatever opposition we were playing in that week, we had selected a team that, had the highest momentum because that was the type of, like, it was just interesting. It was an interesting discussion I remember having a few years ago.
But then at the same time, you'll always have that one guy that's one of the older lads in the team, doesn't do a whole pile of running, doesn't run very fast, but he's just in the right position at the right time constantly. And like we can get pulled into rabbit holes as S&Cs and sports scientists of trying to pick the optimal team, but the like psychological component of the sport and the tactical component just can't be understated.
Yeah, exactly.
We'd love them to be robots to make our job easier, but
one of the things I think, like if we use like one last point of the momentum thing, and like not to do with sleds, but again to do with like peak momentum, so body weight times max speed, is that I think a lot of athletes, whether they understand it or not, they speak about like this balance or like trying to find the right way to play at. And like I've spoken to loads of people about this as well. Like I think momentum could be used in that sense for rugby particularly, because a lot of like I've had instances, you can see in the media as well, where like players like wingers or scrum half seconders, they're like, yeah, I need to try to find the right weight for me to play at. And I think what they're saying is that, okay, I need to try to find the right weight that I can play at, that I'm still like fast enough and like mobile enough without being too light that like, I can't dominate a collision or make a tackle. So I think in those instances, like momentum can be very useful because, say, for example, if you're trying to bulk up in a certain position of rugby, if you put on loads of mass, but your velocity drops so much that your momentum decreases, then I would say that you've probably put on too much mass, or you haven't trained or developed physically and appropriately for that weight. On the other hand, if you try to get really, really fast and you end up getting much, much lighter and your momentum decreases, probably isn't the best thing for like the majority of cases in rugby. So like, I think it could be a useful metric there to like, for athletes and for staff to track as well.
Mate, I'm so glad you said that. And I promise this wasn't planned, but I had Conor Mcguire on last week and he's talking about finding his optimal weight. And he was saying when he was at his heaviest in the Prem, he was at 126. And he found that his first carry and his first hit and his first scrum were always huge. And he felt so dominant, but then he just wasn't able to repeat it after that. So now he's cut like 10 kilos and he finds that he's at a decent weight where he's able to like not shirk the physical battle, but also repeat it throughout the game or throughout whatever amount of minutes that he plays. So we've now got the player perspective and now we've got the science behind it. So that's just
I know Conor, I didn't actually listen to that yet. But 126 kilos is heavy for him. I remember I worked with him when he was in Old Wesley a good few years ago. So I'm glad he's finding the right way for himself now.
Absolutely. He seemed to be enjoying 126 as well, but he probably wasn't enjoying moving around for 60 to 70 minutes. So exactly. We've touched a lot on momentum, but what momentum helps with is like having a dominant collision. And you've been talking a lot about collisions over the last while, well, we say last while, it's probably over the last couple of years. I'd say you might be sick of people asking you about them because of that study in terms of the misconceptions around intensity between international rugby and every other level of rugby. Were you surprised by the results of that study at all? Or were you like, what I hypothesized is correct?
I don't think I was surprised, because when I had initially thought about that study to like determine differences between competition level, I remember speaking to some of the Irish guys, some of the players that were playing with Ireland who came back to Leinster after like a Six Nations. I think it was, I don't know, like it was a few people I asked. I remember, like, I didn't write this down or anything, but I remember just like going around trying to understand what they had or what they felt the Six Nations was like. And I think it was even like Dan Levy at the time. I was like, what, like, he was like, oh, the last two games, like the hardest games I've ever played. And I was like, what was so hard about them? And he was like, the contact. He's like, people just hit so hard at international level. And then a few other players said the same thing as well. So then when I saw the results of this from a collision perspective, I definitely wasn't surprised. And for people that aren't aware of it, we basically, on average, we found that like as competition level increased, collision intensity increased. So I think that wasn't surprising to me. I think the sort of narrative people say is like, oh, the game is quicker at international level or at higher competition levels. That might not be true. And again, like I say, this was like from that sort of 2 seasons we did, and it may be different in like Southern Hemisphere or like different with different teams and different styles. So that's always that you sort of have to mention that sort of caveat as well. But like, I think some people may have been surprised that the game wasn't quicker. So like from a distance or a high speed running perspective. That's not to say like the decision making and stuff isn't faster, but from a physical sense, it wasn't a quicker game. And I think one, yeah, the collisions are just, there's more collisions and they're more intense, but also I think there's just less space at the higher, so like the higher opposition you play against and like the higher competition levels, teams are just better, and like defense is better, systems are better, like players are really, really good standard. So it just becomes like there's less space to do things. So in the space that you have to dominate a collision or figure out a way to get around or through teams. So I think that's what that physical sort of study showed, was that like, okay, it's not necessarily a quicker game from a physical sense. There's a lot more collisions involved in it. But yeah, it's just that sort of manifestation of how much less space there is when you play a tougher team sort of manifests itself differently in a different different physical sense.
And then I've heard you talk before about there's no point in having the data if you don't do anything with it. So then my question would be off the back of that is, how did that then impact your training program, that data from that study?
Yeah, well, one, I think because in Leinster, like the study was across like British and Irish Cup, Pro 14, European and international. Now, so like, it's not to say that you change everything because you want to prepare for the highest competition level, because not everyone plays for Ireland, and the majority of your competition is within Pro 14 and Europe. And a lot of the academy guys in Leinster anyway, we would have played in the British and Irish Cup. So I don't think it's like an upheaval of like, oh, like Leo Stewart, we need to do this because of this. It's like, okay, well, like what competition do you have upcoming, and like how do we best prepare for those? So like, for example, for like a British and Irish Cup game, like it had the highest high-speed running demand across any competition, more so than like Pro 14 and European Champions Cup. So I would akin that to, okay, well, like if that's the case, we need to prepare players who are competing in that competition for a high-speed running demand. So you need to expose them to that or prepare them for that through whether it's pure physical sort of conditioning or game-based scenario training where there's a lot of high-speed running. So like, I think it's just always a conversation with the coaches around, okay, like this is what physically we're seeing. Does this match up with what your sort of game plan is or your training plan is? If it does, then like, brilliant, let's just keep everything the same and we'll monitor it. But if it doesn't, then okay, how can we incorporate some elements of this to make sure that they're prepared? And that, you know, if the coach is like, look, I can't fit that in because I need to cover this, then that's maybe where you do like an additional sort of, or a traditional sort of conditioning top up to make sure that they're exposed to that stimulus. But I do think like the challenge that practitioners had and will have is when players fluctuate through different competition levels. So, I mean, there has been scenarios in the past where someone's played across 4 different competition levels in one season. So British and Irish Cup, and, you know, they may have played in that, come back from injury or something, and then into Pro 14 Europe. But say most commonly, we'll have players that will play Pro 14 Europe and international rugby. And if each of those competitions has different physical demands, mental as well, I'm not forgetting about that, but you need to prepare or recover from those things differently. So if you have like a game where there's a lot of high-speed running, I don't think anyone could convince me that preparing for that and recovering from that is the same as an international game where there's way less running and way more collisions. So like, I think even so nutritionally, I say this, there's a really interesting study that I think I shared out before. It was the addition of like only 20 collisions. And this was like, you know, single tackle collisions increased on average, like calorie expenditure by 1,200 calories. Or energy expenditure by 1,200 calories. So if you think about that in the context of a week, if you do 20 tackles on one training session during a week, like some of the guys in some games would have 60, 80, maybe 100 collisions. And like, I don't know if that necessarily means that, you know, you multiply that by 4 or 5, but, you know, if guys are being exposed to 60 or 80 collisions, that's tackles, carries, or rucks in a game, there's a huge like energy cost to that as well. So like that's a very different recovery and nutrition plan, in my opinion, compared to if they don't have that exposure. If they're playing a British and Irish Cup game, they don't have an extra 60 collisions, they only have 20. So there's definitely elements of that from like, I guess, like support staff side as well, but also preparing for that. Like, you know, do you prepare athletes for a high collision demand by doing more collision training? That's sort of the, I guess, debate or question as well to consider. There's a lot in that, I think, that I don't know if anyone's like cracked the code, but I think that's the biggest challenge, is players changing between those sort of competitions.
Yeah, it sounds like it affects probably the micro elements of the program and the short term more so than the long term, because you can't categorize groups of athletes that you have, like, as you just said, like you could plan for somebody to be in the British and Irish Cup squad for the year, but they might perform very well and they could play above a level. They could even go up to international levels. So you can't plan for that. But like, as well as that, this ties very nicely into what I actually wanted to ask you around World Rugby's new contact guidelines, because you've touched on there, like you could have 20 tackles on a Tuesday, but the new guidelines are kind of measured in terms of minutes of contact that teams can do at training throughout a week. And the problem with that is, how is that defined? Like, because if it's just minutes, one guy could have, as you just said, 20 contacts in those minutes, whereas another guy could get 1 or 2 if he's out in the wing. So are you preparing that player for the game well? Does it discount a lot that we know about tackle technique, learning, and just training principles? Yeah,
like I've seen the guidelines, and like I just don't know them like in and out currently, but I do know that, like, I don't know who's involved in them, but I know like World Rugby has some very good people. Like Ross Tucker is one of the kind of lead scientists there, researchers, and I'm assuming like they've applied some very strong logic to their recommendations. So I think, like, you know, any rule or guideline you can pick apart very, you know, there's always like, oh, but what about this? But I think when you look at it from their sense, it's like, okay, they have to provide guidelines to like the entire rugby population of the world. And not everyone has an analyst who can code every number of collisions, or has GPS technology, or has, like, you know, access to this amount of staff or coaches or support, whatever else. So I think when I look at those, I think of it in that sense. But certainly there are like, yeah, the points that you raised around how do you know if that's the right amount, or if people are being exposed to more collisions within that period, or individual differences, and also how do you know that that's enough to prepare them for the competition. Like, what is it? It's like 15 minutes, is it?
15 minutes twice a week
of direct contact. So yeah, is that enough? I mean, I know in when I was in Leinster, Hugh Hogan, the sort of contact coach, did a huge amount of like technical work. And I say that like in general with all of the athletes himself, and well, all the coaches did, but even in our like rehab process from injury, he was very integrated within like sort of our performance department. So he would do a lot of work, but so I wouldn't say that was contact
I
work
know.
in the
That's the
side, in
problem.
the sense that, yeah, like, you know, it was very fatiguing as such, but it was definitely very important to get that like technical, and it sort of like it progressed towards obviously more live contact the later they got to the rehab process. So I think, yeah, I mean, maybe GPS technology might, you know, solve for that, because I think now, like one of the studies that we did, we sort of, I don't want to say validated, but like we compared collision load to video coded collisions and found like a very strong relationship between the two. So that might be something that someone can do now working in rugby, can collect collision load data across a full season and start to determine injury risk alongside other variables. I'm not going to do that now myself, but someone else listening to this might have an idea. They can reach out to me and I can have a chat about it.
I think you hit the nail on the head. That is the problem. They're trying to cater for the entire rugby playing population, which is just so vast, and like you can't like add a value of 1 to a collision, because one collision does not equate to another collision. They're so different. So I don't know who's going to enforce them as well, is the other thing. Like, but they've come up with them for a reason, I'm sure. I just struggle to see how it takes into account how you would progress an athlete through a training program in terms of progressing from extensive contacts to more intensive.
Yeah, I think with all those, yeah, like there's always like nuances to how you apply those as well. So like, you know, yeah, like it's the recommendation is like twice for 15 minutes. Is that like within a rugby session, is that different? It's there's probably a lot of like, not ambiguity, but like how you interpret it as well, or how you apply it might be different in different clubs as well. But the point you make around, yeah, like collisions not necessarily the same intensity. I remember an example of like one of the guys back in Leinster, I think, had like the record for like the most tackles in Pro 14 or some competition. I can't remember exactly, but I remember everybody saying, oh yeah, his like collision load must be like through the roof. But it actually wasn't, because it was still high, obviously, but because a lot of the tackles were like chop tackles or like very low, the actual impact on them wasn't huge. Whereas you compare that to some of the, you know, like the really, really high impact tackles, that would obviously elicit a higher collision load. So that's like, to your point, I've definitely seen that in some of the data as well, that not every collision, like more collisions doesn't necessarily mean like a higher collision load. It may be, you know, the style of tackle or contact is very different to some of the bigger collisions.
That probably enables him to get more collisions in a game, because he's less fatigued from the collisions, because his technique is so good. And I know that you didn't name him there, but I'm assuming that that fella is also a Wicklow native. But we won't say anything, because mate, I'm just laughing throughout this that you're such a sports scientist / researcher, because anything that you say, you constantly say, now that's not to say, and that's not to say this, because you're afraid of making broadcast terms, which is great, because that just shows how good you are at your job, that you're able to explain everything without stepping on somebody's toes. But if you're hopefully, exactly, you know, that's always the goal anyway. But like, I was looking through your background and I noticed like you have your doctorate and everything in research, and you enjoy peeling through the data and whatnot. But then, like, if you look at your social media, you're quite visual as well in how you present things. So you'd be obviously quite creative as well. So would you say that your new role kind of affords you the opportunity to merge the two quite well? Maybe all of your roles have done that.
Yeah, I think like, I don't know, the visual side is definitely like, I guess you get from applied research. So like, I've never worked in like a lab as such. Like I would do some lab testing now, but like even now, like it's applied research. So it's not like very strictly like academic papers, and like that's obviously part of it. But all of the research I've done has had to be applied directly to like practice, and I think that comes with like you if you're trying to share results to coaches or athletes, you have to present it in a way that they can understand it. So it's like trying to translate it to something like actionable. But the data stuff, I wouldn't say was like I don't know, like a strength when I started. I remember I worked in the high performance gym in UCD before I joined Leinster, and I remember at the time I got some feedback from like a mentor and a friend, George Petrakis, who was working there at the time. And he actually, at the time, I think I had a review, like, a few months in, he said, oh, you're one of the things you need to improve are your data skills. Because he was like, for you to be a well-balanced practitioner moving forward, you need to have like the coaching side, but also the data side. So at the time, like I was like, I had so little experience in it. I didn't even know. And then even coming into Leinster, I started as like probably purely a strength and conditioning intern. And then just by nature of what was, I guess, necessary or needed in our department at the time, there was like space to improve in the sort of like sports science side. And that's how I sort of navigated towards that way. But so I wouldn't say that comes like naturally as such, but it's just by nature. I'd be a pretty curious individual. So that probably ties, it's like hand in hand with researching, but I don't think I would even distinguish the two yet, because I think to actually translate research to like an applied setting or life, general population, anything, you have to be able to like speak in a normal language as opposed to reading out, an abstract or methods and just speaking in scientific terms. So yeah, I think both of them are probably ties in nicely. But yeah, my experience in roles has been like pretty positive in that I guess I've had some opportunity to like be curious and ask some questions, but also try like present and coach and share some data back in a visual sense as well.
I think pretty curious is a bit of an understatement, given that you have a doctorate and a professional diploma in data analytics and statistics. So I think generally people that would be a little bit curious might stop before they get to that level. So props to you for that.
Probably more so curious than like even just, I know, like getting outside of like rugby and going to a different sport and stuff. And then obviously now I find myself just pretty curious as to what like an industry-based role has to offer as well. So I find myself like asking myself a lot of questions every day.
Well, yeah, I'm sure Lululemon are happy that you're asking yourself so many questions. Your girlfriend might not be if she has to listen to all your answers that you're throwing out.
No, in my head.
Right, yeah. Mate, superb stuff. If you're happy, we can move on to quickfire questions before we finish. So
yeah, sure.
The first one is proudest achievement to date.
I actually, because like I thought of this and I was like, I won't go, like, stop me if it's like not quick enough. But I think like probably moving here with my girlfriend is one of the things, because, and it's not to say like, oh, that's a cop-out answer, but like, yeah, like not knowing like what it was going to be like, or like the sort of fear of, like changing industry, moving country and stuff. And like we went through a bit, like my girlfriend went through a lot family wise before we moved and stuff as well. So very proud that we actually moved and like are sort of enjoying it now and stuff and getting to do it. But I think overall, like, so that's not like a strictly a professional or personal one. I think it's just both. But I've always been happy that like I've sort of tried to embrace like not knowing what's next. Even like going to the FA, like the easy decision for me would have just been to stay in Leinster. I was still in contract in Leinster. Like that came around in contract. So I think the easy thing would have been just to stay, but try to sort of get out and see what the world has to offer.
But it's nice as well to reflect on the big move now that you're kind of set up, as you said, like you've got the place furnished and you're starting to flourish, I suppose, in that role, and you're starting to find your feet in Vancouver. So in a way, it's kind of nice to look back and say like, wow, we actually did move over here. That was a big step, because you wouldn't usually kind of even associate that with kind of a proud achievement. I would imagine you haven't really patted yourself on the back as you got a couple of chairs for the sitting room or whatever. Like,
it took us a while to get a few chairs. Oh my God. We bought two sort of as like, we need these, and they were like just very cheap. We were just trying to find, so we had two chairs for a while, and I'm like, we were moving in from one room after working to like eat together and then moving the chair back. So we have a few more now, so we can actually have some people over, which is nice as well.
That's Peter Tierney's proudest achievement is he has chairs in his new
apartment. We have six chairs in the place now.
Next one is favorite athlete of all time.
I think like I'll answer this currently, because I was like, I don't even know, like so many different athletes that I like love watching, but probably currently would be like Steph Curry, probably NBA athlete. I just think like to be the greatest athlete or like shooter or like the greatest of something within a sport is hard to actually claim. But the fact like he's just so clearly like the best shooter ever. And when he plays, it's like enjoyable to watch. And he kind of does it with like a bit of a smile. So it looks like he's kind of enjoying himself as well, which I think is an important thing to remember as well. But him, and then I like Roger Federer is just nice. Just someone who just looks like he doesn't try or doesn't sweat. And somehow it's just unbelievable as well. So probably the two of those guys jump out.
Which do you enjoy more, looking at Steph Curry shooting or looking at his statistics?
Oh, Steph shooting by a mile.
At least you have some actual rationale behind it. Like you can back it up. Like, here's his stats. He's the best shooter ever. There's no argument, as you said. And then Federer as well, the same. You can just look at everything that he's won. Yeah. The next one now, you might hurt a few people's feelings, but it's favorite rugby player of all time.
Yeah, I'm gonna say like who do I was like, oh, I can't say someone I've worked with, but then like, yeah, I don't know. I'd probably like Issa Nasewa. He'd probably like, just as a person, I think like was so well balanced, and he was for the leader that he was very humble, and like he was just always, he just sort of treated everybody the same. And that's not to say nobody else did, but I just thought like, yeah, he's someone who I got along very well with and have a huge amount of respect for. So I think he's probably up there.
A lot of people that have said that he would, like, he's going to be quite a very, very good coach in the future because of that characteristic of him.
Yeah, he's just very well balanced. Very well balanced person.
Next one is, I'm not even sure if you're a football fan, but favorite obscure footballer or footballing moment.
It's probably one that I experienced myself. It was during COVID. We're at a camp, and a match was abandoned at halftime because the opposition head coach had COVID, and we honestly couldn't. The doctor came over to our head coach and was sort of like, "Hey, can I speak to you?" And he was like, "You know, I'm coaching. Like, can this wait until halftime?" And anyway, they spoke, and we couldn't understand it because there was so many protocols in place around like mask wearing and social distancing and everything else, and basically, yeah, just the game had to be abandoned. It was such a bizarre, like we were all so perplexed on the pitch. And looking back at it now, you're like, yeah, just that was a bit of a strange one to experience myself.
How did they only find out mid-game, like, or at halftime? Right? Like, good
question. But it was like just before halftime, so it was actually, I think it was like 42 minutes or something, and we found out. So yeah, that was when the game stopped. So that was a very obscure moment. That's strange to experience.
Obscure. It's great. Any artists you've been listening to a lot recently?
Harry Styles, probably.
Out in Vancouver, it's summer vibes, I suppose, out there. Summer so it might have changed quite a lot. Who's playing you in the movie?
I love what Paul Rudd did, but he's probably a lot funnier than I am. So, but I don't know. He'd make me seem funny anyway.
Paul Rudd is the man. So he's one of the best. Any books you've been reading?
I'm currently reading one called How Emotions Are Made. So that's been pretty interesting. I haven't finished it yet, but worth a read based off of what I've read so far.
Do you know who it's by?
Oh, Lisa, I think it's Feldman Barrett. I think it's a double barrel name. Lisa, I can't pronounce. I can't remember off the top of my head what her surname is, but I'll send it to you afterwards.
Yeah, I'll link it. What's the biggest thing you've learned in the last 12 months?
I think one thing I think I mentioned at the start was that like stress is stress. Like no matter where it comes from, there's like you need to account for all of the things that happen in your day or in your life. It's not just work stress or physical stress. There's everything else that can manifest. So that's probably one. And then I think like just getting used to like, or reminding myself all the time just to like enjoy everything. like I do enjoy that. So I think but it's even more apparent now, like when you move and when you change like industries. And so just to keep reminding yourself to, like be present and just enjoy everything.
What would you tell your 18-year-old self?
I don't know, like, I don't know, like, I don't necessarily have like any big regrets or anything, or, like, oh, like, don't do this, or like, make sure you do this. So I don't think I have any like, big things to say, like, oh, make sure you do this to change your life path, because I've enjoyed the last like couple of years since 18. So I think it probably would just be that, like, that enjoyment thing, and just like sometimes, whether it's in like, the roles that I have in like research or innovation, or like even coaching, like you always end up like planning ahead, and like sometimes you can get caught up in like looking too far ahead. But I think like the planning you do for the future should allow you to enjoy or like be present in the moments or the sessions or whatever you actually live through. So probably just like a reminder of that like, like plan ahead, but like the plan you make is so that you can be present and enjoy, the moments that you're actually planning for.
That's an incredibly profound point to end on. So thanks a million, Peter. That was great. Dr. Peter Tierney. Really appreciate you coming on and really enjoyed that.
Yeah, nice to chat to you, Peter.